week, I scheduled a meeting with someone to help us with our audio-visual equipment, and they were planning to sit down with us to give us some advice how we can improve our live streaming and our cameras in the back of the room. We set our appointment for 2:30 here at the church on Thursday, and I laid time aside on the calendar, and the morning of, the technician contacted me the day we were supposed to meet and said that he had to move the appointment from 2:30 in the afternoon to 3:30 in the afternoon. So I called Mike and a third person that was planning to be here at the church during the visit, and they said that was okay with them, and so we were good. I said, sure. Went from 2:30 to 3:30. But I had already set some time aside in the calendar to meet this gentleman, and now I had an hour to spare. I had time to waste. And what would I do with that time that I had? The time in between. I suppose I could waste it, or I could be productive during the time in between when I scheduled the appointment and when the technician was planning to arrive at the church. We often call these times in the middle, the time in between one event and another event, an interim period or an interlude, if you will. It's the time between two larger moments, two larger movements. Think of two parts of a play. You have the first act over here, and then you have the second act of the play. And that time in the middle, that middle period of time, the time between 2 points, it's the interim period or the interlude, right? You know, the Bible speaks of a very important event. This occurred 2,000 years ago when Jesus came to the earth for the first time. We call this the first coming of Christ. There's another event that will happen one day when Christ returns. We call that the second coming of Christ. And between these two events, between these 2 points in time, there's an interim period. We're living in that time today, in the here and in the now. Our text this morning addresses that period of time. This interim between these two events, the first coming and the second coming, it reminds us that God has given each of us a responsibility while we await the second coming of the Lord. And what's important to God, Christian, is what we do with what he's given us while we're waiting. During that interim period of time, he's given all of us different goals to enable us to share his grace with those in our community, with our neighbors, our friends, our coworkers. What will you do with the time that he's given you? What will you do? How will you live during this interim period, this time in between? We can choose to live in fear with regard to the second coming. Maybe we think the second coming of Christ, his return, is a fearful thing. Maybe we don't feel ready. There's still things we want to do before the Lord comes back. We still have to finish spending that IRA. You know, I've got a savings account. I have plans for the future. Maybe you're lethargic or disinterested. You know, it's been thousands of years. Maybe he'll come back. Maybe he won't. But what will you do with the time and the gifts that God has given to you? How will you live during this interim period? It's the question of our text this morning here in Luke 19, verses 11 through 27. Jesus has been making his way to Jerusalem, this final journey to Jerusalem. It began all the way back in Luke 9. And now, as we arrive here at the end of Luke 19, near the end of Luke 19, Jesus is very close to the city of David. Last week we looked at the first part of Luke chapter 19. We saw with the story of Zacchaeus, that Jesus has now arrived in Jericho, just roughly 17, 18 miles outside of Jerusalem, and he's still there. He's still in the house with Zacchaeus when we arrive at our text. They're there talking, fellowshipping, speaking to all those who are present. We read in Luke 19, verse 11, and when he heard these things, what things are we talking about? Well, you remember we left off in Luke 19:10, where Jesus said, the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which is lost. Those listening, they didn't fully grasp what Jesus meant by that statement. Understand, the Jews, they had always envisioned Messiah in a certain way. They saw Jesus, they saw the Messiah as a powerful military leader. You can sense that theme drawn all throughout the Gospel of Luke. In fact, if you recall back in the very first chapter, in a song that's very well known to all of us, Mary sang in Luke 1:52 that God has put down the mighty from their thrones as she thinks about Jesus' coming. Zechariah, her husband, says something very similar. Just a few verses later in verses 70 and 71. Zechariah saying, he spoke by the mouth of his holy prophets that we should be saved from our enemies and from the hand of all those who hate us. And so those in Israel, you see, they saw Messiah as the one who would come and overthrow their oppressors. And in their case, Rome. He would come and set up a new Davidic kingdom when he came. And since Jesus was that Messiah, they had seen his miracles. And since he was now arriving on the final leg of his journey to Jerusalem, naturally they thought that time was coming now. Here he would finally bring justice to them and to the rest of the Jewish nation. I'm sure they supposed that Jesus was about to bring about this kind of Jewish triumphalism and to inaugurate a new Israeli monarchy. At any moment, he would do this. But for Jesus didn't come the first time for those reasons. He didn't come for that. He didn't come to right all of the wrongs socially. Jesus did not come to straighten out all civil inequities. He did not come the first time for those reasons. He came to seek and to save the lost. Jesus, at his first coming, came to offer salvation to anyone who would trust him, and very soon he would die on the cross in their place, in our place. And soon he would rise again. He didn't come to make the world a better place, to right all earthly evils. Jesus didn't come to fix things or to end injustice, to bring an end to crime, to stop abuse, to destroy wicked and evil institutions. He didn't come to end poverty, slavery, or any other corruption. He'll do that at his second coming when he returns. But during this interim period of time, Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. But because of that wayward thinking, that idea that his kingdom could appear at any moment, and because Jesus was now at the final leg of his journey to Jerusalem, he illustrates and he communicates truth to those listening in a way that stuns them. And he always did this, something that would surprise them, but in a way that was memorable. He gives those listening a parable, starting in Luke 19:11. Now, as they heard these things, he spoke another parable, because he was near Jerusalem, and because they thought the kingdom of God would appear immediately. This parable in Luke 19, verses 11, all the way to the end of verse 27, it really has two goals. It's speaking to two distinct audiences. Jesus, like any preacher, any pastor standing here before a congregation, understands that there are those that are listening that know him personally, those that have trusted him. And there are also at times those that are listening that have no vested interest in the Lord or his mission. And so Jesus' first message in the parable is speaking to those who have rejected him, his kingship, his right to rule. He takes an event out of their recent history, one that most are listening probably had lived through, and many who study this passage really see it as a backdrop to the story that Jesus says here in Luke 19:11 through 27. How many of us have heard of Herod the Great? Familiar with Herod the Great? Heard his name before? Okay. Herod the Great was a very, very horrible ruler. He died in 4 BC. And that was about 20, 35 years just before this event, right? Well, he was succeeded by his son, Herod Archelaus. I was about to say Antipas. There was a division among the people about who should be Herod the Great's successor. And there really was no good choices. And in the end, it came down to 2 options. There was Herod Archelaus and Herod Antipas. Archelaus was King Herod's choice. He had put that in his will, right? And he was the one who he wanted to succeed him when he died. But the people, they did not like Archelaus. He was a horrible ruler. He was a cruel ruler. He was brutal. And something had happened on the Passover the year Herod the Great died in 4 BC. During that Passover celebration, that year, there was an opposition to his rule that had erupted. Archelaus responded to that opposition by slaughtering as many as 3,000 Jews with his army. And you know, the Jewish people, they never forgot that. And so when it came time for Archelaus to ascend to the throne, like any vassal king under Rome, he had at the time, he was required to go over to Rome and to meet with Caesar. And so he heads up to Rome to meet the emperor. What Archelaus did not know is that 50 Jewish diplomats were also in Rome during his meeting with Caesar. Their job, their goal was to convince the emperor, to convince Caesar that Archelaus was unfit to be ruler in their province in Palestine because of his viciousness. Well, they failed. And Archelaus soon became king. But when he returned, he had those Jewish diplomats, those who wanted to usurp his throne, he had them killed. And understand something, that most of Jesus' listeners, they didn't just know about those events. Many of them had lived through them. And so they were very much aware of this. And I think this tragedy, it offers a very good backdrop to this nobleman's departure in verse 12, and then his return in verse 27. Imagine this in verse 12. He said, a certain nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and to return. Skip to verse 14. But his citizens hated him and sent a delegation after him, saying, we will not have this man to rule over us. The story concludes down in verse 27, where the nobleman, after he returns, orders those under him to, verse 27, bring here those enemies of mine who did not want me to reign over them and slay them before me. So that's the parable's first storyline. The nobleman's departure, his rejection, and his return. I imagine the simile that Jesus was drawing with Archelaus probably shocked those listening, and I think that was what he was trying to do. But you know, Jesus is not finished yet, because he adds another storyline within it. We can call this the story within a story. And it's the part that relates to believers. It starts when the ruler leaves his servants behind to raise capital while he was away. The nobleman, as we read the parable, it says that he picks out several servants, workers from all walks of life. I'm sure these servants had different abilities. He had given each of them, however, the same share. He gave them a mina. 1 mina. Some translations will have a pound. This is 3 months' wages. Now, that may seem like a lot. But really, 3 months' wages, you can't do a whole lot with that in investments in the long run. And he had just one command for the servants. One command, one piece of instruction: occupy till I come. Put my money to work until I return. The master has entrusted his money to his servants as stewards of his funds. Notice there's nothing in the parable that describes whether he expected them to be successful. He required effort on their part. And the question is, what would they do with what he gave them? The story doesn't tell me what all of the servants did. There are 10 servants. We learn only about 3 of them. What we do know is that each one got to choose what they did with the mina. They had the freedom to choose what to do with their share. Now, some because of fear that they would be beaten, or for doing business for the nobleman, or maybe just out of fear for him. For whatever reason, we don't know, these did not do anything. They took their mina back and put it aside. They did no business at all for the master. Their master was gone. He wasn't there to supervise the efforts. He wasn't there to watch them or to look at their fields, to check up on them. And without the master, these servants, they could do a lot of work for themselves. And they made a good profit, I'm sure. He was gone. And it was up to them. One servant comes to mind. I imagine this servant is maybe a banker. Right? He had experience probably in the best savings accounts, access to some of the best IRAs, some of the best CDs. But instead of investing his master's money in any of those, instead of opening a 401k, instead of doing anything, he rented a safety deposit box in one of his bank's most secure branches. And he wrapped his mina up and he locked them away until his master returned. Now, he did a lot of business for himself throughout the years, but instead of increasing his master's funds, he and many others like him spent their time growing their own bank accounts, building their own funds. But at least 2 servants stood out from all the rest. These servants, as they're thinking day after day, they could hear the master's words saying, "Take it and do business until I come. Occupy till I come." It wasn't easy for these servants. Remember, the citizens in their country, they hated the nobleman. The townspeople worked day after day to remove any mention of this aspiring king. They didn't want him to rule over them. I'm sure the servants were treated horribly for their commitments. And over time, as they worked, it became harder and harder to invest in nobleman's capital. There was a lot of pressure from the citizens of the country. They hated the nobleman. They despised everything that he stood for. They'd come to one bank, the servants would, and they'd hear the same thing time and again. "Your money's no good here. We're closed for business to the likes of you." It seemed everywhere they turned, the people around them wanted to shun them, wanted nothing to do with them or their nobleman or his funds. They had a lot of challenges. They probably had anxiety over the fear of not just losing the mina, but anxiety and stress over the late nights and the early mornings that they would constantly put in, rising early to work and to try to raise the capital. But they had their gifts. And they knew that they only had a certain set of time. So they put their minds to work. If one of these servants were living today, I imagine this servant maybe being an experienced stockbroker, you know. He knew everything there was about the NASDAQ and the S&P 500. He had the background, he had the experience, and he was a risk taker. He knew you never got anywhere without taking a risk. He knew where to put the money, which funds to invest in, which ones would bring the fastest return on his investments. And soon, after a while, that 1 mina became 10 mina. The second servant wasn't a stockbroker, didn't have the background of the first servant or the other shareholders, didn't understand Wall Street, wasn't a buff like that. But he did what he could do best. He had experience in real estate and homes, so he bought houses, as he had always done, and he fixed them up, and then he flipped them. And over time, he managed to raise up enough funds to buy an apartment complex. He got some renters, and as time passed, he gathered enough funds to buy another, and then another. And each year, he would look at his gains, and he earned a modest return on his capital. By the end, 1 mina soon became 5. And there you have it. 2 servants, they put their mina to work, they invested it, they took the risk. 1 became 10, another became 5. And then we have our banker, who wrapped his share up in a napkin, had it locked away safe and sound in a vault. And after a period of time, the nobleman returned, just as he had said he would. And when he did, imagine the hysteria. People must have been running in every direction. The king is coming. Some were running toward the ceremonial gates to meet the new king. Others, they were running away. Some were so excited they dropped everything and ran to see their new master. Others quickly closed up shops and ran away. They didn't want to see him, they didn't want to meet him, and they had a lot of good reasons for it. But others, like these 2 servants, wanted to show their master what they had earned. And so they ran home and they gathered their investments together, counted them all out, and pushed their way through the crowd. By now, the drums are booming, and the shouts from the army, which he brought back from them, are overwhelming everyone. The host began to sing and cheer cries of victory and praise. The gates are thrown open, and there he came, riding on a great white horse. He lines all his servants up, one by one, to see what each of them had done with their mina. You can imagine their hearts by now are beating in their chests. The doors of the throne room are opened, and the first servant is let in. He's anxious, and he's excited, and he's afraid, I suspect. He approaches his master's throne, and he bows his head. Those present, they lay the workers' earnings before the king. In verse 16, then came the first, saying, Master, your mina has earned 10 minas. Master, see what I've done. The 1 mina you gave me, look, master, 1 is now 10. The king rises off his throne, and to the shock of everyone present, he bows before the servant. And with a smile on his face, I imagine, we read in verse 17, the king speaks, well done, good servant. With a twinkle in his eye, we read, because you were faithful in very little, have authority over 10 cities. You honored me with the little that I gave you. Now watch as I make you Lord over much. Everyone is cheering those that are watching, can you imagine what a reward? Verse 18 now describes the second servant as he approaches the throne. They lay his earnings before his Lord. Master, your mina has earned 5 minas. King's face is bright again, and you will be over 5 cities. I mean, the crowd, they shout again, the trumpets blow. No one can believe it. 1 mina had become 10. 1 had become 5. But 10 cities for 10 mina. I mean, the award, look how it outweighs what they brought. See, it was not how much they gave to him, but what they did with it that made the difference. All had the same, but the reward was according to what they did with it. All that matters is what we've done, what he gave us. Then the banker comes in. Everyone is watching him as he approaches the throne, his mina still wrapped in the cloth. Listen to this servant's excuse in verse 20. Master, here is your mina, which I have kept in a handkerchief. Verse 21, for I feared you, because you are an austere man, a hard man. You collect what you did not deposit and reap what you did not sow. This banker tries to turn the tables on his master. And he paints this picture of his master. He makes him out as being someone who exploits others and works things to his own advantage. You know, if I were sitting there listening, I would think right now is about the time for the master to begin to stand up for himself and to put this servant in his place. I mean, after all, as you're watching the way he treats the other servants, that should have been enough to prove that that wasn't true. That was a lie. And you know what? The master, he doesn't defend himself. Instead, he looks at this servant with kindness, but also a bit sternly. If you genuinely believed that I was a hard man, then you would have put my money to work. If this is true, what you say of me, then why not invest my mina? At least I would have gained some interest. You see, he knew the servant was lying. Had this servant truly feared his master, he would have obeyed the instruction in verse 13. He would have gotten busy and served the master. He truly feared him like that. Take what he has. Give it to the one who has 10. That servant, that banker, who started out with nothing, entrusted with a mina to invest, ends the way he began. He started with nothing, and he ended with nothing. You see, they were all given time to invest their mina, the master's mina, while he was away. And when he came back, where he found them was where they would spend all the days of the kingdom. And so we read, I say to you, to everyone who has will be given, and from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. You know, Luke 19, 11 through 27, it's just a story. It's not real. It's a parable, right? But you know, friend, we are real. And Jesus is real. And Christian, Luke 19 is about you, believer, and it's about me. And it's about our master. And as Jesus said in John's Gospel in chapter 14, I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go, I will come again Mark 13, verse 34. Jesus says, the Son of Man is as a man who, taking a far journey, has left his house and gave authority to his servants, and to every man his work. He's gone to receive a kingdom, Christian. And if he trusted him as your Savior, then he has entrusted you with a mina. And your mina is your own life potential. Someone has said, the nicest thing about our God is that he trusts us to do so much by ourselves. You know how true that is? Maybe you're sitting here and you're thinking, I don't have what others have. Others, they have so much more in ability. They have more money, more talent. But as you study this parable, you recognize it's not a matter of what you have. It's not a matter of your prosperity or ability, because God doesn't judge us based on how much he has given to us. He judges us based on how well we have used what he has given. He judges me by my faithfulness. And he judges all of us by our stewardship, by our character. And as Jesus told us all the way back in Luke 16, verse 10, he who is faithful in little will be faithful in much. Amen. Christian, you either use the time that God and the gifts that God has given you, and one day receive a reward for the work that you've put forth for him. Or one day, you will stand before him. And like so many believers, you'll watch as what he's been entrusted to you burns up in the fire. And you'll watch as God, as the master says, take from him who has one, give it to him who has 10. Everyone who has will be given. And from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. Success breeds success. It's simple, Christian. We either use it or we lose it. You can use what you have, and God promises to reward you for that. Or you can hide in fear and watch as it fades away one day. What's it going to be, Christian? The command's simple. Occupy till I come. Are you going to do it? Will you give yourself for him during this in-between time? Maybe you made that commitment a long time ago, but you've wavered. Well, what are you going to do about it today? Our lives, James said, they're like a vapor. They're gone. They're gone just like that. What will you do? Because God will hold all of us accountable for the mina that he has given to us. But Jesus promises everything to those believers who are willing to risk everything for him. What are you going to do with your time, with your skills, with your relationships? What will you do with the mina that he has given you? How are you investing your life